Right, afternoon all. Welcome to another session of computer, not computers architecture, sorry, but client operating systems. Gotten a bit used to lecturing on the computer architecture module. So today we're looking specifically at your system utilities. I think the second session, or the second chapter associated with your prescribed textbook, which is the dealing with Windows installation. I've already conducted that one, and it's been uploaded onto the channel. Please do yourselves a solid and look through that content as well. Again, like I mentioned before, you'll discover that most obviously is a bit repetitive, especially comparing with that computer architecture module. I got a bit tongue-tied at the beginning there is concerned. So naturally, what you want to also distinctively look at, I think, again, as far as today's session is concerned, you'll also discover that some of the content we've also looked through as far as Comp Arc is concerned, but obviously just revisiting and just ensuring that we're all on the same page in terms of understanding exactly how these particular architectures function as far as your computer system is concerned from a holistic point of view. So you've got utilities that are associated with every distinctive operating system at large. And naturally, when you look at these particular platforms, you'll discover that these particular utilities are softwares or software in general that is intended to analyze, configure, monitor, or assist maintain a computer system. So without these particular utilities, then it makes the whole usage of the operating system a bit of a cumbersome process when it comes to the appropriate functionality as far as your computing platforms they are concerned. So these utilities are just generically standard programs in size, and they literally could be included, obviously, with part and parcel of the OS, or can be distinctively incorporated separately. It all depends in terms of the configuration that you've got as far as your particular operating system environments or system configuration there is concerned. So what you want to generically understand here is that when you look at your utilities, let's see if we can write this accordingly. Ultimately, we mentioned that this is distinctively software intended to analyze generically configure, monitor, or assist maintain a computer system. So that's generically what your utilities are all about, just ensuring that there's smooth functionality associated with your computing mechanism. So ultimately, what you're looking at as generic examples in this particular regard, you can discuss antiviral packages, right? You can distinctively look at disk repair, applets, file management, security, obviously, and networking programs. Excuse me. So these are the typical examples of some of the utility software that are out there that are usually bundled with your operating systems. And some of them, like I mentioned a couple of moments back, would obviously be installed as third-party software platforms. So normally you'll discover that when it comes to utilities, it's all about understanding and using the settings to literally configure Windows 10, understand administrative tools that are relevant in terms of system configuration and maintenance, usage, you name it, and looking at managing hardware components, understanding and configuring power management, naturally configuring displays as well, not forgetting the use of your task schedulers as far as the Windows PowerShell environment when it comes to your computing mechanisms there. Now, I think the first section that you'd want to literally concentrate on or understand is the settings overview. And excuse me, most configuration options literally can be accessed through this particular settings menu. It's something we've looked at before, but again, let's distinctively revisit it so that, again, like I mentioned before, we're all on the same page. And naturally, you find that this particular settings platform is distinctively organized into different categories for easier access. And you'll discover that in older versions of Windows, like for instance, Windows 7 and beforehand, the control panel was distinctively used to access configuration settings as far as your particular environment would go. But now with your Windows 10 environment, you've got a separate settings platform that is distinctively responsible for that particular setup there. So let's have a quick look in terms of what this particular environment distinctively looks like so that you understand exactly what's happening in that particular platform there. So when you look at your generic desktop, remember right at the bottom there, you've got your taskbar, and then on the left-hand side, you've got a section that enables you to search for content on your local machine, as well as your distinctive web environments there. So in that search section, we're going to type out, or we're going to search for your settings. There's a settings app that is there. That's the one that we want to distinctively concentrate on. And once you click on it, it should distinctively open up your Windows settings there as far as your specific setup there is concerned. So these are the different options that are associated with your settings environment. Like I was saying earlier on, most of the content that you'll find in this particular section there was distinctively found in the control panel when you're dealing with the older operating systems as far as your Windows distributions they are concerned. Like I mentioned before, Windows 7 and earlier would be that distinction in that regard. So you've got your system all the way to update and security. And each one of these particular settings obviously are responsible for something specific within your environment. I think it's important to be able to understand where to find these particular settings and be able to understand exactly which one of the settings there is relevant in terms of the configuration that you want to distinctively take into consideration at that distinctive point in time. So with your system setup, literally that's just basic general purpose in terms of the settings associated with your Windows 10 installations there. So it's just about general purpose configurations that you find. So you incorporate and distinctively work with display all the way to apps for distinctive websites, depending on configurations that you've got. Obviously, you'll have a short summary in terms of some of the content that you'll find there with systems. So you've got your display, sound, notifications, and obviously power management in that regard. If you were to select it, you will distinctively find that this is the generic setup there associated with your system configuration there, where you've got your display, your sound, all the way down to your about configuration as far as your specific setup there is concerned. And obviously, when you're looking at display, again, I think that is a bit self-explanatory in certain aspects, where these are the settings that are just used to configure the screen resolution and obviously scaling apps and text. Just again to better user experience as far as your specific Windows install there is concerned. So whenever you're looking at configuring your display, working with sound, adjusting power settings there, obviously when you're both on a desktop and a portable computing platform, it's imperative for you to understand exactly a way to find those particular settings and how you can configure them accordingly as far as your specific setup there is concerned. So there's not much really in terms of understanding the goings on, but just being able to find where that particular content is distinctively the most important aspect as far as working with configuration settings there is concerned. So you've got your display all the way down. Again, like I mentioned before, each one of them arguably specific in terms of basic configuration. I think you can always play around with your own systems there to see exactly what is happening in that specific environment as far as setup is concerned. So we go back to the home configuration there, and you select your devices. Again, with this particular setup, as far as your configurations are concerned, the whole concept of the devices section there is just containing settings for obviously configuring hardware that your computer system distinctively connects to, as far as configurations there is concerned. So if you look at the first option, as far as this particular machine there is concerned, Bluetooth is literally enabled, and currently I've got a specific set of headsets that I've got plugged in, connected via Bluetooth in that regard. It actually even gives you the name of the wireless configuration that is there, and obviously the amount of battery left as far as that distinctive gadget is concerned. So when you're looking at wireless connectivity, as far as your specific devices are concerned, specifically on the Bluetooth environment, you've got this particular section of your devices being able to accommodate for that specific setup as well. Obviously, with your bounded configurations, in terms of connectivity to your USB ports, will also be incorporated in this distinctive section. So all it's doing is looking at including all the local hardware, such as the devices that are obviously connected to a distinctive USB port. It also generically includes devices connected rather over a network, such as your distinctive printer in that setup that is there. So most categories in the devices section there have links for more detailed configuration settings. So you'll normally find on your right-hand side there, you've got basic settings associated with your distinctive setup. So you've got more Bluetooth options, for instance, should you need to enter that particular section to look at better configuration or more configuration if you're looking at it from a different perspective. You also have a section that enables you to get more content off the net. Should you be struggling to connect, for instance, your whatever device that you've got incorporated there, you can always find the relevant information within your environment as far as your specific setup there is concerned. So we've got Bluetooth currently selected. If you click on printers and scanners as well, it will show you a record of the printers that are typically associated with the machine that you're using, and also allow you to add specific printers dependent on the environment that you've got. And remember, like we've mentioned before, especially when looking at computer architecture, when we're dealing with the printing section or the printer section or your multi capability as far as basic devices there in that particular section are concerned, we looked at how to distinctively add a printer either on a local platform or over the network, or obviously adding that particular printer using your wireless configurations as far as setup there is concerned. This is obviously the specific section where you find that specific content incorporated there. So its main purpose is just to display the printers and scanners that are distinctively connected to that particular computer, like I said before, locally or distinctively over the actual network itself. You literally can actually add and or remove devices in that specific setup that is there. But there's no advanced configuration options that you'll distinctively find in that section as far as your setup there is concerned. So you'll find that certain information or certain content would be in accordance to the actual device that you're distinctively using as far as your setup there is concerned. So whether you're using a desktop or an actual portable device, whether you're using a touch-enabled environment or your generic machining mechanisms, you'll find that this particular section as well is relevant for that particular setup, which is obviously your device's configuration. So, for instance, your mouse, your touchpad, obviously being able to use a distinctive pen in specific environments there. So this is more applicable, like I mentioned before, when you're literally using a tablet, as far as your Windows 10 configurations would go. So the devices section's main purpose is just to literally look at configuration of all the hardware that your machine is distinctively connected to, as far as your particular setup there is concerned. And then ultimately, you will also have, for instance, your network and internet, which is literally one of the most relevant sections as far as your Windows settings environments would go. The reason being, more often than not now, you'll discover that no machine literally exists as a standalone or lone entity anymore. There's some kind of connection to some kind of network as far as these particular computing mechanisms are concerned. So it's obviously imperative for you to understand specifically how to appropriately configure distinctive network settings, and also knowing what particular types of networks you're connecting to literally assist with the appropriate communication platforms within those distinctive environments. So both bounded, wireless, whether you are literally connecting to your local environments or connecting to the internet, or distinctively working with virtual private networks. This is a platform that distinctively enables you to look at that configuration there. So both wireless and bounded architectures are configured in your network and internet. And you look at some of the options that are distinctively incorporated there, would obviously be your Wi-Fi, your Ethernet, your dial-up, VPN, all the way down to a proxy there. Currently, it shows you the kind of wireless network that this particular machine is obviously connected to, and shows you over the past couple of days the amount of usage as far as basic data across that internet space there is concerned. And again, like I mentioned before, if when you're looking at the Ethernet environment as well, your bounded connectivity, you've got that particular section in this particular setup as far as your configuration will go. So the current connection that is there, or the current option that is selected, is your status, which is just generically a specific section that shows the status of the network connection and whether there's any connectivity to the internet as far as configurations would go. And obviously, this shows you that distinctive connection in that regard. Obviously, wireless, looking at your or Wi-Fi, looking at your wireless communications in that specific environment. You also have advanced settings in that particular section as well that you can typically work with, that enables you to configure appropriately the wireless connection that you've got in that particular aspect. And then with the Ethernet, like I was mentioning earlier on, this is where you're looking at your wired or your bounded communications. You can also even view IP address configurations there as far as your network adapter is concerned. So obviously, when it comes to network architecture as well, you will discover that the content that is relevant in that regard, especially when it comes to you dictating or configuring your manual or automatic assignments as far as your IP address configurations are concerned. Your Ethernet space is your default go-to in that regard. That enables configurations as far as your particular setups would go. And then obviously with your VPN, which is again something that's quite relevant when it comes to connectivity, especially within the office space from remote localities. This particular setting allows you to create connections and manage them, obviously, as far as these particular connections being active. So you literally can turn this on and off over your metered networks, dependent as far as your particular setup would go. You also have your flight mode. I think we're all familiar with that from our mobile phone configurations as far as particular setups would go. So if you click on your Wi-Fi, you'll again it'll show you Wi-Fi connectivity there, the name of that particular connection, and then enables you to literally look at advanced settings as far as your particular wireless communication platform there is concerned. It's the same thing that you'll find within your Ethernet space as well. like I was mentioning earlier on, it's imperative for you to understand the actual implications of automatic and manual assignments and how you would configure that when it comes to your local machines. Excuse me, not just on your client configurations there, but obviously within your server-side platforms as well, as far as your particular setups is concerned. So we click on Ethernet there. As you can see, you've got changing adapt options. You've got your network sharing center incorporated there, the basic Windows firewall that is incorporated. And obviously, it'll even show you that there's no current wired connections as far as this particular machine there is concerned. Obviously, if they are, it's easy for you to look at configurations. So if you look at your adapter options, for argument's sake, excuse me, it will show you that current connection that you got there is your wireless connection as far as configurations would go. As far as your actual Ethernet setup, there is no current connection that is there, but should we choose to change the settings of this particular connection, once that particular connection is there, you'll see the Ethernet properties that are there. And when you're looking at configuration, obviously what you want to concentrate on is the Internet Protocol version 4 setup, your IPv4. As far as your specific environments there would go. If you were to click and then select OK or double click on that particular option, gives you exactly the same setup, or click on it and then select your properties, you'll find a section where you now can incorporate manual assignment of your IP addresses. So normally by default, most of these machines, if not all of them, come with this particular option enabled. So you or activated or selected. So that automatic assignment of IP addresses from your DHCP server, for instance. But when you want to manually assign these particular IPs, or you want to statically assign an IP address when it comes to your computer system, or when it comes to your server, it all depends. This is the specific section, obviously, that you want to distinctively deal with. So if you select use the following IP address, you literally can incorporate an IP that you want to work with. By default, the subnet mask is automatically populated for you. But if you're dealing with a custom subnet mask, then you can always change it in that regard. Your default gateway is normally associated with the router, or obviously that device that enables connectivity to your external networks. So default gateways are distinctively associated with the router as a specific device that, again, like I mentioned a couple of seconds ago, enables connectivity to an external network in that regard. So obviously, I've asked you to look through the IPv4 lecture of the YouTube channel. I'm assuming that all of you have had a look at that particular lecture. So it makes sense in terms of you understand exactly what it means to discuss DHCP, what DNS is all about, and obviously the assignment of your IP address version 4 configurations would go, not forgetting the actual relevance or importance of having a subnet mask incorporated within your network infrastructures there, both default and customized, to enable proper configuration of your network setups. So this is obviously where you plug in. So if, for instance, if I was going to incorporate a Class C IP address, for instance, you'll discover that the moment I click on my subnet mask environments there, automatically that particular section of configuration is automatically populated, because there's that automatic identification of what particular IP address you plugged in, or which particular class this particular IP address falls under. So for instance, if I go 192.168.7.18, for instance, right? The moment I click on my subnet mask, it's automatically populated for me, because the system has already identified that this particular IP address that has been plugged in is a Class C address as far as configurations there is concerned. And then you can always populate the default gateway accordingly there. And should you need to incorporate a DNS server, you can always go ahead and do that. So both preferred and alternate, should the preferred configuration not function accordingly, you can always have a fallback configuration that is there in that regard. So this is where you'd access these generic or basic network settings as far as your configurations would go. It's also applicable, like I mentioned earlier on, not just when it comes to your assessments, obviously for this particular module from a practical point of view, but also when you're discussing network architecture as well in that distinctive regard. So that's the generic setup as far as your network setting platforms there is concerned. Same difference would go with your VPN environments there. You can choose to obviously allow for these particular VPNs over a metered connection or not, and then distinctively configure them accordingly as well as far as setups would go. So should you not be familiar with the process, you can also even find net content from the net directly in that particular section that enables you to look at the help from the web space as far as your configurations there would go. So the other thing as well that you'll also want to discuss is the account section as far as your particular setup would go. Shows the current information associated with the account that is currently there as far as your particular setup there would go. And it's just about creation and configuring of user accounts and this in this specific environment. So you've got your info all the way down to sync your settings. So your info, just settings that allow you to configure such things as your picture, as far as your user account is concerned, you being able to change the local account to authenticate by using a Microsoft account. You've got your emails and apps, sign-in options that will obviously include you incorporating a password every time that you log on to your profile or log on to an account, or removing that option dependent if you want to log in directly, whichever way works in that regard. But obviously, more applicable in environments where security is not as relevant in that regard, which is a rarity really as far as today's environments there is concerned. So this is a typical example of what is happening as far as your setup is concerned. So basic email accounts that are incorporated there as far as configurations would go. Same difference would go with the basic sign-in options I was mentioning earlier on. So you can sign in obviously with a distinctive password. You can use a picture password. You can have a security key incorporated there. You can use your biometrics as typical examples of accessing content or accessing that particular account or profile, dependent on environments that you've got as far as your specific setup there is concerned. So that's the basics really when it comes to your settings section as far as your platforms they are concerned. And then naturally, you can also look at your update and security as distinctive options associated in that environment there. So what this particular section enables you to do is look at controlling how updates are distinctively run as far as your system would go. Remember, it's always important to have these incorporated to make sure, again, there's some kind of smooth functionality as far as your install is concerned, and also looking at the best user experience that can literally be provided for. But again, it's a double-edged sword scenario because not all updates are good updates if you want to look at it from a different point of view, because some updates can be rolled out again without proper testing, or literally with a basic oversight of maybe problems that might arise in terms of certain application packages no longer functioning accordingly after an update has been installed, or the machine working intermittently after a certain update has been installed. I think this is the reason this is the reason why virtualization becomes quite relevant in that regard, because you can then look at testing these particular updates before they are literally rolled out. If there are any discrepancies, then obviously you can literally put installing that particular update on the back burner until it's been appropriately configured or fixed or any glitches alleviated. And then you can now incorporate that particular update accordingly in that regard. So you can set up how that particular configuration is incorporated in that regard, looking at your security recovery as well as the generic activation associated with your machining platforms that are incorporated there. So obviously your backup and recovery platforms also quite relevant and important Why? Because these particular settings enables you to configure file history features that literally makes backups of files to an external hard drive. So should you have any discrepancies with your machine, you can always get your backed up content from your external storage platforms. Recovery, same difference applies in that environment that lets you reset your device to try and restore operating system functionality as far as your setup is concerned. So this is just looking at your Windows 10 getting reinstalled. But normally you'll discover that this also deals with your restore points, for instance. You end up losing certain content when it comes to your files that were literally either created or saved certain days or dates after a recovery point there is incorporated. So these are some of the things that you might also want to take into consideration. But if it means taking your machine back to a point where it was functioning without issues and probably losing a couple of files in the process, maybe that is not such a detrimental scenario. But it's irrelevant in terms of you just understanding how it functions and obviously what you need to incorporate in that regard. So obviously all that content is found within this particular section as far as your generic setup there is concerned. So if you go back again to the home section, these particular installs also assist with simplifying access to individuals that might be visually or physically impaired or have some kind of hearing impairment. So your visual, physical, and hearing impairments are literally accommodated for by ease of access. So if you look at your ease of access settings as well, that would typically help with that. So making text much bigger for individuals to be able to read accordingly, should they be obviously visually impaired. And again, that whole concept of just looking at the user experience being more or less prioritized in the way in which your particular operating system functions in that regard. And then so that's I think that's pretty much that when it comes to your settings there. Yeah, everything that looks at basic configuration or even advanced configuration, if you look at it from a different point of view, is literally found in your Windows settings environments as far as your Windows 10 installation there is concerned. Another particular section from the utilities point of view that also looks at assisting with configuration, assisting with the whole concept of basic analyzation and monitoring of the way in which your particular operating system functions is the administrative tools section. And it's more or less a collection of system configuration utilities that are distinctively grouped in a specific category, which is obviously your administrative tools. That is obviously found in either the system section or directly in your control panel environment as far as your particular configurations there would go. And you'll find that most of the tools that are in this particular category use your Microsoft Management Console applet, which is just distinctively a GUI shell that provides some kind of structural environment to actually build management utilities as far as your specific operating system platform there would go. So you'll find that a lot of network administrators distinctively use your MMC or your Microsoft Management Console with the basic snap-ins that just enable performance of these different management tasks that are incorporated as far as your specific environments there are concerned. So we're going to look at what this particular administrative tools section distinctively looks like. So you also familiarize yourself with that specific setup that is there. And remember, a snap-in is just distinctively a component that adds some control mechanisms to the actual console, obviously for a specific service or generic object in that regard. So let's quickly look at what this particular administrative tools platform looks like. So let's generically look at the control panel. And if you look at the control panel, the first option that you find within that distinctive environment there is your administrative tools section that is there. So that's what you want to look at and understand exactly what this particular section provides for. Again, like we were mentioning earlier on, just different sections that are there that make it a lot easier for proper management as far as your computing system mechanisms there are concerned. So you're going to click on administrative tools there. And in a couple of seconds, you'll find the different sections that are associated with the administrative tools platform. So you've got your component services all the way down to your Windows memory diagnostic as far as that particular setup is concerned. And again, like I said before, such particular sections like your disk defrag utility, we've covered in computer architecture rather before, and also the whole concept of your disk cleanup, even computer management, where you can also work with your disk environments or your basic storage platforms as far as your machine configurations they are concerned. So such sections like your event viewer, which is literally used to view messages from basic apps or Windows 10 within your particular machine as far as configurations would go. And why these messages are useful is that they assist with troubleshooting errors. So you know specifically when a specific error occurred and what type of mechanisms that you want to, or fixes that you want to put in place to ensure that your system functions without issues in that regard. So obviously the version of Event Viewer that you find in Windows 10 is distinctively unchanged from the version that you'll find in Windows 7. So they've literally stuck to the same configuration that you find there as far as your specific configurations would go. And then if you look at the iSCSI initiator as a typical example of your storage configurations, that is a particular protocol that literally allows computer systems to communicate with external disks over basic networks or over a standard Ethernet network. So that's what the iSCSI initiator is all about there. It's a protocol that allows computer systems to communicate, obviously, with external disks over standard Ethernet networks. And remember, SCSI, which is short for Small Computer System Interface, as far as your particular setups they are concerned. So more often than not, this particular architecture is distinctively used for storage or with external storage devices as far as your particular environments and setups there are concerned. The ODBC, which is short for Open Database Connectivity, is just generically a standard mechanism for applications to access databases. So ODBC, once again, Open Database Connectivity, and it's just a basic platform that is there for applications, for instance, like your Microsoft SQL Server, to be able to access databases in that regard, as far as your configurations would go. So you'll find that a lot of network administrators distinctively would look at configuring this particular architecture or this particular applet to communicate with a proper database as far as configurations there would go. So this literally isolates the application from the database, making application development a lot easier and provides for greater flexibility when choosing a distinctive database that you can use. So you find that obviously your Windows 10 would include separate tools for both the 64-bit and the 32-bit configuration there. And then when it comes to Performance Monitor, again, as the name would say, used to distinctively monitor and troubleshoot performance issues within your Windows 10 environment there. So obviously it includes the ability to monitor many system resources, literally including your processor, the disk, your memory, and the network in terms of your particular setup. And you'll find that this particular performance monitor can log resource statuses over time and generate reports. So it's all about just checking what is actually happening in the background. So if you run that performance monitor environment there, as far as your specific setup is concerned, you get your distinctive environments that are there as far as configurations would go. So just checking for the basics in terms of both your well, not both rather, but in terms of your memory, your distinctive processor, also looking at your disk and network connectivity at large, as far as your specific environments there is concerned. The other thing that you also want to look at is the basics in terms of system configuration, which literally gives you access to boot configuration, things like your startup applications and generic system tools, as far as your configuration there is concerned. So if you look at your system configuration, which is that particular setup there, it just looks at the whole concept of how your machine boots, right? So your startup selection, normal startup, loads all device drivers and services, or alternatively, you can select the diagnostic startup that literally looks at loading basic devices and services only. Then you will also have the selective startup that then enables you to load services and load startup items, and then distinctively look at original boot configuration as far as your particular installation there is concerned. If you select the boot tab, it also looks at your default operating system that is there. Normally, you'll find that if you've got multiple OSs, you can have obviously them listed in that regard from the different partitions that you can configure as far as your or different sections that you can configure as far as your system there is concerned. Again, you've got different boot options that are there as far as basic configuration there is concerned. You've got the option also of making some of the, if not all of the boot settings that you've configured there as distinctively permanent. If you select the services section, it will show you what services are currently running, which services have stopped, and distinctively look at who's the actual manufacturer associated with the generic services that might be running in the background as far as your machining mechanisms there would go. Remember, every time that you use your machine, like we've mentioned before, you always have background processes that are running that obviously just enable smooth operation as far as your system environment there is concerned. Again, with the same concept of your startup that literally works hand in hand with your task manager configuration to show you what type of processes are running as far as your setup there is concerned. And obviously the last section would look at the different tools that can be used as far as your machining mechanisms would go. And then you also have a short description of what each one of those distinctive tools within your environment there is responsible for, and what it does and what it distinctively shows you. So earlier on, we were talking about the performance monitor, and that shows you that it monitors the performance of local as well as remote machine mechanisms. Task Manager there just enables you to view the details about programs and processes that are distinctively running on your machine in that regard. So this is just a generic setup there that shows you basic system configuration in terms of your particular setup. And the other thing as well that you also might want to take into consideration is your system information. All right, so it shows you the current system that you're running as far as your configurations there is concerned. looking at the OS, looking at the manufacturer of the actual system at large. And then you've got different components that are there, which we'll obviously discuss in a moment or so. Things like your direct memory access, your input-output configurations, your interrupt requests platforms, as well as your memory, how each one of these are incorporated in your system, how they assist with proper system functionality, and what the main purpose is all about as far as providing for distinctive configuration as far as your particular setup there is concerned. So ultimately, that is distinctively found in your system information section as far as your computer system there is concerned. And again, like I mentioned before, the whole concept of your MMC or your Microsoft Management Console platform is distinctively found in your computer management environment. So MMC is this particular section that is going to be populated in a couple of seconds or so. And this is also something that you literally should be familiar with, especially the storage section there that shows you the setup associated with actual disks incorporated with your computer system mechanism. So you've got, so if you look at for instance, your storage management section there as a typical example, again, with the partitions, just understanding exactly what's happening in that regard, different types of partitions, the file systems that you're using, and which one of those partitions are the ones that are running your operating system as far as your specific setup there is concerned. You also look at distinctively the capacity associated with your particular storage, as well as what is currently used and what is free in terms of access and usage in that regard. Now, if you want to look at it from a different point of view now, when you're discussing the whole concept of, especially when you're looking at your Microsoft console access modes, you've got 4 distinctive types of modes associated with the way in which you access this specific section as far as your computer system is concerned. So you've got what they call the author mode, you've got the user mode with full access, you've got a user mode with limited access, and then you also have a user mode that deals with the same limited access but dealing with single windows. The other one deals with multiple window configurations as far as your particular setup there is concerned. So if you want to look at what that distinctively looks like, especially as far as display mechanisms there is concerned, let's see if we can quickly go back to this particular section here so that you get an understanding of what's happening in that regard. So if you look at the whole concept of your MMC console access modes, if I can mention this as your Microsoft Management Console access modes, which is something that you're also supposed to familiarize yourself with. You got something along these lines. Let's see if we can quickly populate that slide here. So you're looking at something that mimics what we've got on screen currently. Let's see if we can expand this a bit so that it's slightly more legible. Right, so you've got something along these lines here. So this is what the access modes are all about. So like I was mentioning earlier on, you've got the actual access mode and the short description in terms of the way in which you access that computer management environment or that Microsoft management console and configuration we're discussing a couple of seconds ago. So with that, you've got the author mode, which looks at full customization of the actual console, that being allowed as far as configuration there would go. And obviously this is a default setup that you'll normally find, which is what we were looking at just before we shared at this particular screen. And then you've got the user mode that also deals with full access. So this literally removes some kind of ability to obviously add and remove the snap-ins we were talking about earlier on. And again, just to revisit that whole concept, just remember that a snap-in is just a component that adds control to the actual console for obviously specific services and specific objects in your environment. And then you've got your limited access when you're dealing with multiple windows. Then you also have a limited access when you're dealing with single window environments. So this is also something that you will need to familiarize yourself with as well, in terms of understanding exactly what's happening in that regard when it comes to these particular configurations as far as your particular system is concerned. So part and parcel of what is happening as far as your computer management environment would go. So you've got your task scheduler, event viewer, you've got your local users and groups, your performance, the disk management section that we were talking about earlier on, that is also relevant as far as your machine at large is concerned. So for instance, if we go back to what we were looking at earlier on, in order for us to familiarize ourselves again with that specific environment at large, if we go back and let's see if we can show this particular content there. Right, so if you go back here, we were looking at the whole concept of where were we? I think that's computer management, exactly. So you've got obviously the section there that deals with the generic computer management, which looks at system tools that literally contain your task scheduler. And as far as that particular section there is concerned, it distinctively looks at obviously providing a way to schedule programs to obviously run at a particular point in time, or when a particular event distinctively occurs. Then you've got your event viewer, right? And that particular section main responsibility is to obviously allow for, it's another, just generically another way to access the same information that you'll find obviously as the same event viewer section when you're dealing with administrative tools. Your shared folders, something that you also need to familiarize yourself with, especially when it comes to not just this module, but network architecture as well. Just a way to view shared folders on a local system. And this also includes the hidden shares or a distinctive path to an actual share within your environments, and obviously the number of clients connected to each distinctive share in that specific section or environment. And then again, you can also even discuss the whole concept of your generic local users and groups, which deals with the basic account settings in that regard. So we've already looked at the whole concept of what's happening with your performance section. And like we said before, you can also even discuss the device manager configuration in that regard, which obviously looks at a way to distinctively monitor or provides a way to modify configurations of the hardware devices within the actual system at large. And then within the storage section, which we've looked at a couple of moments ago, you are literally looking at the whole concept of just being able to manage the storage devices that you've got incorporated. So this it literally just used to manage hard disks as far as your machine would go. So you can partition and format distinctive disks within your environment. And then lastly, the services section, as far as your specific setup there is concerned, just enables you to enable, configure, as well as disable certain services within the Windows system environment, and then ultimately also look at providing some kind of control and security when you're dealing with the Windows management instrumentation, which is the WMI, which is distinctively used to perform remote monitoring and management of Windows there. So if you look at your services section, there's different. You can still access the same services platform by using the run applet and typing out services.msc, your Microsoft console, which is a typical expansion of that extension, or obviously within the same computer management platform, you can distinctively double click on that and be able to access. So the other way, if you use your run applet, you can distinctively type out services .msc and be able to access exactly the same platform as far as your configuration there is concerned. And obviously, when you access this, you'll be able to look at just applications that are running in the background, right? So in essence, these applications, again, like I was mentioning earlier on, allow for a smooth functionality of your system at large. Without them, it makes it very difficult for the system to function without any distinctive discrepancies there. So it allows the whole concept of applications to run in the background, obviously without user interaction. And in essence, you find that services typically perform tasks for other software applications or perform housekeeping tasks for obviously the Windows 10 installation or operating system. And one of the classic examples of this would be your DHCP, which is responsible obviously for communicating on the network to get distinctive network or IP address within your environment that obviously allows Windows 10 to access servers and distinctive the internet at large. Windows Firewall is also a service that is run within this particular section. So you've got the name of the actual service incorporated there, the basic description associated with the service, as well as looking at the status of that service and the startup type as far as these particular headings that you find incorporated there is concerned. So you've got a short description of what each particular service is all about, whether that particular service is currently running and what is the startup type. Do you need to actually manually run this particular service, or is it automatically started the moment you boot up your machine? Or is there some kind of delayed start? It all depends in terms of the actual configuration that you've got in that regard. So that's that particular section that deals with the whole concept of administrative tools, and obviously, again, looks at appropriate configuration of your system at large to avoid that particular system not functioning accordingly. One of the other sections as well that we also want to concentrate on is the hardware management section. And with this particular section, you're looking at managing and maintaining your computer's hardware. And these particular tasks obviously are performed regularly by network administrators just to ensure, again, that smooth functionality of your system at large. So your device drivers, the whole concept of your driver compatibility, whether these particular drivers have been tried and tested. I think we've mentioned this before in computer architecture when we discussed the whole concept of signed and unsigned drivers, right? And remember, we've mentioned that when the driver is signed, it's been tested and given literally the go-ahead with a bit of a guarantee that there's no distinct or known discrepancies in the way in which it functions if you install and use it. And then unsigned drivers are drivers that have not been tested. So these could literally function intermittently or cause system instability at some particular point in time. So an unsigned driver doesn't literally mean that the driver won't function when you install it and work accordingly with the appropriate hardware component. But there's no guarantee that that particular driver would function without any distinctive issues across the board. So it's imperative for you to take that into consideration as far as your particular setups there would go. So more often than not, you've got your device manager, obviously, which is literally the primary tool that enables you to work with device drivers. And the main purpose of the device manager is literally to allow you to actually view and modify hardware device properties in that regard, as far as configurations would go. So some of the actual tasks you'll find in Device Manager, which you'll find again under computer management, there's Device Manager in that aspect. Naturally, as far as your particular setup is concerned, is just basic determination of whether a specific installed hardware device is functioning without issues. looking at changing hardware resource settings, which we'll obviously look in a bit in terms of the IRQs I was mentioning a moment or so back, being able to enable, disable, as well as uninstall devices is also another typical function provided for as far as this particular setup there is concerned. So for instance, if you were to select, just for argument's sake, maybe look at your disk drives there, you've got your SanDisk, a 240 gig SSD incorporated there. If we right click on that particular hardware component and we select our properties, you look at the general setup that is there, you can actually check and see the device status associated with that particular component. You've got the different policies associated with that particular device. In this particular instance, the whole concept of the caching policy that is there as far as this particular storage configuration there is concerned. Also being able to look at the whole concept of the volume, and then the drivers we were talking about a couple of moments ago. It shows you the basic information associated with the actual driver, which allows for that particular device to function without distinctive issues on a specific operating system platform. Obviously, in this particular instance, which is your Windows 10 setup that you've got. So you've got the driver. You can also look at updating and uninstalling that device in that regard. But in most instances, like I've mentioned before, should there be no need for that particular, if it's been functioning without issues for the particular time that you've been using this distinctive device, then whether an actual driver update is there or not, some instances it might not be necessary for you to just upgrade the driver for the sake of upgrading. If there's no need for upgrading, which means that if that particular component has been functioning without issues, then ultimately you shouldn't be upgrading these particular drivers willy-nilly just for the sake of it. But obviously, if there's a specific problem or a specific issue with that distinctive device, then it would be relevant for you to distinctively incorporate content in that regard accordingly, as far as particular setups there would go. So obviously, like I was mentioning about the drivers in terms of them being signed, it's just an issue of some kind of guarantee that a specific component will function without issues as far as configurations there in that regard are concerned. So this is just a typical example of what your device manager configuration is all about. So if you want to look at more actions, you can discuss the whole concept of being able to view your devices by type, by connection, by container, by resources, like we were mentioning earlier on, as far as configurations would go. So these particular resources, again, you've got four main resources that are out there. You've got your DMA, which is short for direct memory access. And this is a bit of a legacy configuration that literally allowed devices to communicate directly with memory without having to go through the processor. That's the whole, what that particular architecture means. And that's the whole the term or that's where that particular term came from, in terms of devices literally being able to go and access content or instruction sets, whichever way, directly in memory without actually having to go through your actual CPU as far as configurations would go. And you normally find that the devices that worked with this particular architecture was typically your generic or distinctive sound cards. Then you've got your input-output ranges. So let's just look at resources by type here so that you see exactly what I mean. So you've got direct memory access, you've got your input and output ranges, you've got your interrupt requests, and then obviously your memory incorporated there. So your input-output ranges, this is literally just the address which a device can be communicated with. So it's an address that would identify an actual device within the system as far as your specific setup there would go. So if we expand that, these are the address ranges associated with identifying the specific devices within within your system at large. So you've got that particular range for the system timer. You've got that particular range for some of the motherboard resources. You've got that particular range there for the PS2 keyboard as typical examples that are there. So this is just a set of addresses that are used, or a range of addresses that are used to identify a connected device and to enable that device to be communicated with. And obviously, a single device can have several addresses within your particular setup, which obviously with each address allowing access to a particular device feature or component. So a single device can have several addresses, and obviously that single device would have different sections, different portions, different components, different features that are all accessible using these different addresses as far as your specific environments would go. And then when you look at the whole concept of the IRQ, this is just basically a mechanism for devices to request audience with the central processing unit, right? So whenever devices need the attention of the CPU or need access to the CPU, for argument's sake, IRQs are the ones that are used to do that. So it's a mechanism for devices to request time from the actual CPU as far as access there would go. So that's the reason why it's called an interrupt process, because you're literally interrupting functionality of the CPU or what the CPU is doing, so that the CPU gives you, or gives that particular device rather, undivided attention, if you want to look at it from a different point of view, as far as configurations would go. And then lastly, you've got the memory that is there, which is literally the address ranges in system memory that are dedicated to a specific device. So remember, you've got your generic memory that is there. You've got address ranges, again, that are associated with a specific device as far as your configurations would go, just like we saw with your input-output ranges in that regard. So obviously, this is not the only way to access your device manager. Like we mentioned before, you can search for it. You can access it through your control panel. You can also access it through your distinctive search section here. So for instance, here, if we were then to type a device manager there, you'll find that it's already incorporated as part of a control panel applet. Just click on it, and again, you'll find same content incorporated in that regard. So here, you've got your device manager now with a dedicated menu that is there that still enables you to access the content accordingly, like we were seeing a couple of seconds ago, as far as these particular hardware resources are distinctively concerned. So that's the generics when it comes to hardware management in that regard. So what you're looking at is your device drivers, compatibility, the device manager at large, and obviously basic processes of adding as well as removing hardware components within your configuration as far as your particular setup in that regard there is concerned. So what you're supposed to remember, I think if we can go back to our notes here, is the whole concept of what is happening with your hardware resources. So here, one of the other things that is also relevant in this regard is distinctively your hardware resources. And like we mentioned earlier on, you've got DMA, short for direct memory access. You also have your input-output ranges. You can also discuss the IRQs, your interrupt request. And then you can also discuss your memory. So those are the four main hardware resources that you obviously need to remember as far as your specific setup is concerned. All right, as far as configuration there would go. So the other section that you also want to look at is your power management environments, which literally looks at your advanced computer power interface or advanced configuration as far as your power configuration there is concerned. So ACPI is one of the relevant configurations that you'll find as far as your power management is concerned, advanced configuration and power interface associated with your setup. So when we're looking at the generic settings earlier on, there's that power section again that we were mentioning earlier that's found within your settings that just shows the different settings associated with your power configurations there at large. And again, if you want to look at it from a different point of view, if you go back to that, let's see if we can quickly go back to our system here. So if you discuss the whole issue of your system set or your settings in general, I think that's more applicable for us. So we go to your settings. And remember, if you select your system settings section, you've got your power and sleep options that are there. And generically, you can use the advanced power settings option to access additional settings that are relevant in that regard as far as your particular setup there is concerned. So you can choose to change the balanced setting that is currently incorporated there, or determine what actually happens when you're functioning this machine. So for instance, when you look at the settings, these would be different, obviously, if you're looking at it from a desktop configuration, because here, because you're using a portable device, you've got to choose what happens when you close the lid as a typical example of configuration that is incorporated in that regard. So if you want to distinctively determine what happens there, if you select that particular section, you'll show you what you can take into consideration when you press the power button, or when you press the sleep button, if you've got a dedicated button for that. And obviously when you close the actual lid associated with your portable machining mechanism in that regard. Ultimately, you can also look at changing the current settings that are there. So if you click on change plan settings, you can choose to turn off the display on battery when it's 5 minutes, turn the display off in 30 minutes when it's plugged in, 15, putting the computer system to sleep when it's on battery, and never when it's not on battery, when it's plugged in directly. It all depends in terms of the actual settings that you've got incorporated as far as your particular system there is concerned. So this all falls within the same vein as far as your distinctive power management environments there are concerned. I think one of the other things that you can go around and play around with as well is the whole concept of the task scheduler, what that particular configuration does, and obviously what is happening as far as your Windows PowerShell configurations there is concerned. So this is just more or less the same as your command line interface environments, really. The only difference now is that obviously specifically configured to enable you to manage services, manage processes, manage networking, edit your registry, manipulate files and folders, retrieve event logs as far as your particular setup is concerned. So if you were to look at what your distinctively PowerShell environments would look like, so here, if we go with our Windows PowerShell as an app, you can choose to run that as an administrator. I think maybe let me close this again so that you see exactly what I mean. Just the same concept associated with your associated with the whole concept of your command line. So you can choose to run it as an administrator as far as your particular setup there is concerned. It all depends in terms of what you want to look at. You also have the ISE, which is short for integrated script or scripting environment. As far as your setup there is concerned, enables you to create specific scripts when it comes to the way in which your system runs in that distinctive environment as far as your configuration would go. So in essence, you'll discover when you run this also, it provides color coding of an actual script as you type it to obviously enable you to identify whether you're making an error or not, as far as syntax errors specifically, as far as information there is concerned in that regard. So you can choose to run that as an administrator. And again, like I mentioned before, this particular environment, as far as your shell setups are concerned, is just exactly the same as the underlying architecture of your command line. But again, like I mentioned before, the main focus is all about managing services all the way down to retrieving event log events as far as your particular setups there are concerned. So this is just a typical example of what is happening as far as your Windows PowerShell setup there is concerned. So for instance, if you want to look at it from an example point of view, like we mentioned, with the IAC platform, you can always look at running specific apps or running specific commands within this environment to enable you to familiarize yourself with that particular setup and to see what actually takes place when you're distinctively incorporating content in that regard. So for instance, if you want to look at just a typical example of maybe checking the time configuration that is there in this particular setup, we can type out get service. And what we're actually looking for there in terms of the actual name of this particular service, it's going to be your time environment. And as far as the actual setup there is concerned, the moment we hit enter, it should then just show us what that specific applet is all about, the actual status of that distinctive service, and obviously the generic name that you got incorporated there. And then you also can find that there's the same similar commands that obviously enable you to literally display information in a sortable grid that is obviously similar to a spreadsheet, but it's more of a snapshot that obviously that you can't update. It's more a snapshot of what is happening in that regard. So a typical example of this is if we go with get process, and this particular process that we want to distinctively look at in this regard is the grid view. And if we hit enter, we should get some kind of snapshot associated with the processes that are run. So you can't literally edit this. It's just incorporated generically to show you what is currently running, what kind of processes are associated with it, what kind of resources are being used in that regard as far as your particular setup is concerned. All right, so I think that literally looks at what's happening in terms of the actual services, as well as basic utilities that you can use. Also look at, like I said before, task scheduler. Also look at your display settings, familiarize yourself with that. And then again, I think to allow for added understanding of content, the review questions that begin at page 118 to 120 as far as your particular prescribed textbooks they are concerned. So look through, what do we have here? So for your generic research, look through review questions. Come on, let's write this appropriately. Again, review questions on page 118, or let's rather say on pages 118 to 120 of your prescribed textbook. These will obviously assist in you understanding content a lot more when it comes to the whole concept of your utility. So like I said before, the second chapter's content has already also been uploaded on the channel. Please do yourselves a solid and look through the client network operating system playlist in that regard as far as content is concerned. So I'll be uploading this a little later on today, and also sending you the slides we've created during the course of the lecture. Right. Do we have any questions, contributions, and or concerns? Feel free to use the chat section or use your mic. Do you have any questions, contributions, and concerns from the floor? Questions, contributions, and or concerns from anyone? Any questions, contributions, or concerns? Right, so it seems that we're all good. Thanks for attending. Keep smiling, be of good spirits. We'll see you in the next session, where we'll be discussing the whole concept of, I think with CNOS, this is, yeah, so we'll see you tomorrow again. So we'll be looking at chapter number 4, which is all to do with the whole concept of your file systems and understanding exactly what's happening in terms of generic storage as far as your Windows 10 installs are concerned. But otherwise, we'll see you in the next one. Cheers.